They called her just the help. Then he stood up and said her name. "I reckon she's the only one in this town with a real backbone," he said. The wind had a voice that afternoon. A thin, patient thing that ran its fingers over the barn roof and stung the porch posts. Dust picked up from the lane, swirling in the sun like a slow, tawny curtain. The barn that stood behind the farmhouse was the color of old tobacco and big enough to hide secrets. Sometimes it swallowed light whole and kept quiet. For all its size, it could feel empty. The emptiness settled in corners, gathered in the high rafters, sighed through slats with the dead sparrows that had found their way in over the years. Tonight, to the farmer's daughter who swept the floor, the emptiness pressed close as a breath. Her name was Elsie Mae Harding, but no one called her that except the woman who had given her life, her mother, who kept her head bent over jars of preserves and the stove. The town had a dozen names for her that were softer than a rope and harsher than winter. The help, farm girl, little Elsie. Words that fit in the same pocket as gossip and half-truths. She did not like them, but she wore them like a second apron. Practical, invisible at a glance. People had a way of sliding off when she moved. She had learned the motion by heart. She kept her chin even with her work and let her hands do the talking. She was plain-spoken and steady, the kind of woman you would trust to mend a fence or stitch a torn collar until it looked mended not out of pride but necessity. She had grit-tough fingers from years of hauling water and stacking hay. Her hair, when she braided it for the day, smelled of cornstalks and the faint sweet of soap. She had eyes that said more than her mouth would, kind-eyed, weathered, carrying a kind of unspoken invitation that no one seemed fit to accept. When she looked at someone, it was as if she was weighing them, not to judge but to see if they could be leaned on. Most days Elsie's world was measured in chores. The stove, the henhouse, the washtub. Each task a step away from the memory she kept folded in her chest. She was alone not by choice but by circumstance. Her father had died 2 winters past, leaving the farm to a barn that had been banged up by time and a house that settled into itself like an old man. The bank had been patient for a while, then patient no longer. The town had its own slow law for folk who were shrinking. Pity first, then scorn, then advice on how to make do. Folks told her to sell, to take a position in someone's kitchen, to marry. They meant well in the way that knives mean well. They thought they were helping. Elsie kept serving, kept helping, kept waiting in the way a well-tended pot waits for a boil. She swept the saloon floor because the saloon keeper's wife had once been kind to her mother. She patched the preacher's son's trousers because he'd tipped differently one Sunday. She kept a steady hand on her work, a quiet moral center in a place where small cruelties passed for weather. The town had a sheriff and a preacher and a mayor who all had their loves and their grudges. There was the new teacher with chalk-stained fingers and the widow from the south who made a point of knitting mittens for the children. There were people who loved to speak loudly from porches, their voices carrying like the wagon wheels creak. They made a sport of knowing everything and a pastime of making people feel small. On a late afternoon when the lamplight didn't yet fill the saloon rooms, the creak of the saloon door split the hush. The place smelled of tobacco and old whiskey, steam from tin mugs, and the sweet sharpness of coffee. Boots struck the floorboards with the kind of zest only a man who had ridden all day could have. He had a hat that looked like it had been to the edge of the world and back, a presence that was cautious and sure all at once. He had a way of sitting that made you reckon there were stories folded into his clothes and that he'd rather hold them than tell. Folks called him Jonah Barrett, though some older men muttered other names from quieter nights. Outlaw, veteran, man with a past thick as tar. That day, he stepped into the saloon and his eyes found Elsie, as if he had been looking for her all his life without knowing the shape of her. There was a stillness that fell, little like the hush of snow. Jonah didn't draw attention. His gaze was curious, not leering, and it made Elsie's hands feel heavier when she poured the coffee. He was a big man but not cumbersome. He moved like someone who had learned to keep to the middle of the road. He had guilt in his bones, the sort of guilt that makes a man keep to himself, and yet his face softened when it saw the steady courage of another person who carried their mistakes like a shroud. He listened more than he spoke. He watched, And what he saw was the way Elsie kept working even though the town had a habit of saying things in circles until a person was dizzy. "You can sit there, Jonah," the saloon keeper said, a man whose dignity was stiffer than his waistcoat. "We don't saw horses in here unless the coin matches the saddle." Jonah smiled with a weathered something that made people trust the grin without question. "Not here for a horse," he said. His voice was low and certain. "Coffee if you've got it. And the woman who runs this place, she's good for a story." The saloon was full of characters who loved a good story because stories meant they had business anywhere they went. They turned their heads like owls when Jonah spoke of Elsie. It made them weightless to talk about her. There was a riff of laughter, a cheap and sharp thing that scraped like gravel. The town's shamer, Miss Lazenby, made a noise that was meant as a knife. She had the kind of politeness that was sharp-dressed and meant to be remembered. She held herself as if she were a portrait in motion. She had the habit of trimming people with her words. "You mean the help?" Miss Lazenby said loud enough to carry a point. "She's the woman who spends more time sweeping than smiling. Good help makes a saloon, but a good wife, well, that's a different breed." The room tilted toward the insult like it often did when a question of worth was in the air. Elsie felt the comment spread like a dampness through her clothes. Her hands stopped. For a moment, the world reduced to the weight of a cup. She lifted it, felt the heat, and put it down again. Her face went still. People took a breath and waited for her to bend, to fold under. She had been folded before and knew the motion. Jonah's gaze tightened, quiet as coiled rope. He felt something climb in his throat that tasted like salt. He had seen women take the brunt of a town's appetite for control, had felt it in his bones when men who had never known longing called themselves judges. He had been through courts that judged men in less subtle ways, in gun smoke and in the way men laid down their pride on a gambling table. He knew humiliation when he saw it. It made him want to stand, the way a man might stand for a comrade in a place where rules were bent like wire. "You know," Jonah said softly, tilting his head toward Elsie, "I reckon she's the only one in this town with a real backbone." The saloon turned, that slow cascade of necks like a field of grain in wind. It was quiet enough to hear the kettle hiss in the corner, the distant whinny of a horse tied to the post outside. For a moment someone knocked a glass and it chimed like a small bell. Miss Lazenby's mouth opened like a drawer being forced, bright and offended. She had been the kind to think that everyone was for the taking, that lessons were taught by those with money and posture. Jonah's voice was a hand that changed the shape of the room. It did not strike like a hammer. It settled like the first rain on dry ground. It wasn't forceful. It was true. Elsie felt it like a current go through her. The simple recognition unbuttoned a fold of fear. She kept her face controlled. She had learned to hold silence like a shield. It had kept her from saying things that would make her small, from revealing the thing she had folded inside. She moved through the room like someone who can carry sorrow and keep it from staining the floor. There was a hum in her ears, a sound like the wind through a cracked window, and for a second she let herself imagine the barn full of laughter and not of emptiness. "You got a tongue for that, Jonah?" Miss Lazenby said, chin high and voice syrupy. She chewed on a piece of disdain like a sweet. Around her a few people tittered. The saloon was a theater for such cruelty. It pleased some to watch a person shrink and then make a moral of it. Jonah lifted his mug in a kind of salute. "Ain't all tongues worth using to bite, Miss Lazenby," he said. "Some we use to build. Some we use to defend." The words were simple, a measured thing. Miss Lazenby huffed and returned to the business of pinning eyes and gossip like birds to a line. Even so, in the quiet left behind, a seed was planted. Jonah had said her name not in passing but as if it were something to be kept. Recognition sometimes has the gravity of law. It can call a person upright who has been stooped for so long they forgot their own height. The days that followed had their ordinariness. Elsie mending, pouring, pulling weeds by the fence. The sun browned her shoulders and left a map in the freckle of her forearm. She began to notice small gestures from Jonah. He would see her on the porch and tip his hat. He would leave a sack of feed by the barn when he rode by with tradesmen. Sometimes he would stop and fix a slat that had come loose. He did not come with words much. His quiet was deliberate and careful. Folks saw him and made stories in their heads. It is a habit to fill empty spaces with gossip because it is easier than filling a barn with hay. On a morning when frost still laced the wheel ruts and the kettle in her kitchen made a soft, steady sound, Elsie found herself carrying a basket of eggs toward the saloon. She had a habit of giving to people who needed to eat, and she had felt the town had more hurt than bread to last the week. The air was thin, the kind that makes the eyes water and the throat feel dry. The barn sat against the horizon, a hulking silhouette, strong and patient. It was empty this morning because there was no hay to make room for. It echoed in the way big things echo. On her way back she saw Jonah beyond the fence, a small figure against the field, tending a fence that ran along the property line. His hands were sure and quiet, and the way he knelt to pick up a rock, his face shaded by his hat, made Elsie's chest feel like a place where something wanted to rise up but didn't know how. She touched the locket she kept under her shirt, an old thing with a picture of her parents inside, and felt for the seam of the world where her life might change. She had been wrong about such things before. People come and go like seasons, but Jonah was different. He moved like a man who had learned to be careful with other people's pain. He had gravity, and gravity bends things toward it whether you want them to go or not. She kept to her chores, but at every quiet hour her thoughts drifted like smoke. The town kept on. The preacher kept his sermons pointed and thin. The shopkeeper haggled with farmers. Children played marbles in the lane, and Miss Lazenby plied gossip like a craft. There was a public cruelty that took an artful turn in her, and it kept doing its work. It made shade where the sun wanted to land. Then came the night that changed the angle of the light. It was the county fair, where the town laid out its best and its worst in equal measure. Pies with crusts like lace, cattle paraded like ornaments, and laughter at the expense of those who fell. People dressed in their Sunday best and their Sunday worst, all wanting to look like they had enough. Elsie had been coaxed into going by the preacher's wife, who told her that the world required one to show a face sometimes even when it hurt. She wore her good dress, the one that had once hung on her mother's wedding clothesline and had a seam that still remembered dances. She had braided her hair and tucked a sprig of dried rosemary behind her ear because rosemary was for remembrance. And she wanted someone to remember her as more than the help for once. The fair glittered with lights, gas lamps that made halos, lanterns swaying in the soft night. There was the creak of wagons and the cluck of hens in cages, the distant bray of a donkey that made children laugh. The scent of kettle corn and coffee wrapped around people's ankles like pets. Jonah was there, leaning against the rail, watching with a look like a man who had a meter for trouble. His boots were clean, not to attract attention but because some men keep their own order. For a long time he had been content to be a watcher, but that night the town's cruel heart beat loud and sharp. Miss Lazenby, with the confidence of a woman who had never known want, found her moment. She liked to set a stage where people could fall into roles, and the fair was her theater. She stepped forward, voice smooth as a new coin, and called attention to Elsie, making room for the town to mock. "Oh, look at that dress," she said, loud so everyone could hear. "It's a fine piece, but I suppose even good cloth can't hide one's station. Can it?" Laughter chimed like a string of small bells. Elsie felt the room tilt. People circled like vultures waiting for the bone of humiliation to break. She had learned to keep her hands quiet and her face still. The thing inside was a furnace that burned without flame. She would not give them the satisfaction of a collapse. Jonah's face changed in a way that made it clear he had only one kind of patience left. He stepped forward slowly, like a man approaching a ledge with a rope. When he spoke, his voice filled the quiet like a blanket. "You know, Miss Lazenby, a dress don't set the worth of a woman. You can put silks on a horse, but it's still got the same stubbornness. And a woman like her, she's got something worth more than silk. She's got backbone." That was all he said, simple and clean as a knife. But the sound of his voice forced eyes to quietness and made the laughter die down as if it had been clipped. The night faded into the kind of silence that makes a person feel their own breath for the first time. Elsie stood still, her fingers in the basket she had set on her arm. Her lungs were a small, steady drum. Jonah's defense was not loud. It did not have to be. It was a line in the sand. People watched him as if he were a man doing a very dangerous thing. It is dangerous to stand up in such a place. But Jonah had weighed things for his life and decided that saving one person's dignity was cheaper than letting it be stolen. The rest of the fair continued around them with the indifferent clatter of games and music. But in the center, a small drama had been pushed into a quiet that felt like salvation. They left not long after, Elsie with the basket and Jonah by her shoulder like a slow shadow. For a long while they walked in silence, the road shimmering with heat from the day that had been. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't give her a long speech. He simply walked beside her as if that was something to be done. Elsie found that the silence between them was like a hand held, quiet and real. Thereafter, Jonah's interventions were small and steady. He mended fences and left in the farmhouse a cup of sugar when he came across the fields. He fixed the barn door's rusted hinge and built a new shelf in the pantry so the canned goods wouldn't topple in a storm. He did not make a show. He kept his help ordinary, like bread. Each act was a stitch sewn into the torn place inside her life. People watched and made notes. Some reshaped their words. Others doubled down with meaner small talk. But every time someone reached for humiliation, Jonah stepped different. Not with fury, but with a gravity that made people think twice. It was like someone who had been in a storm now carrying a lantern. Then, the inciting act happened with the quiet weight of a door closing. A traveler came through town, a man with a smile and a flank of stories and a hand quick to help himself to another person's lunch. He had been spending nights at the saloon, giving the owner's coin in exchange for attention. The traveler had noticed things about people like he had a talent for finding loose ends. He found Elsie's ease and thought it was a thing to take. One evening, when the saloon was smoky and the light thin, he put his hand on Elsie's wrist while she poured coffee. It was a touch that expected a certain softness in answer. Elsie pulled her arm away with a stiffness. That stiffness folded into the room and tightened like a wire. Miss Lazenby took the traveler's side because she liked being part of the cutting edge of ill intent. She laughed, and with laughter she gave her consent to a public trespass. The traveler did not hear Jonah in the room. Jonah, however, heard the scrape of someone stepping too far. When someone claimed property in a person, Jonah's old bones remembered other kinds of taking. He had been a man with a buried past. He'd seen men take what was not theirs and watched women reduced until all that remained was a shell. Something in him chose that evening to act. He stood slow as a tide and walked over, putting himself between the traveler and Elsie without a word. The saloon held the breath of a room that knows a fight may come. People waited for a drama to spill out like blood. Jonah's hand was low at his side, not a fist but ready. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence was a dam for the town's cruelties. "I've had my fill of men making their comforts out of people," Jonah said in a voice that was more winter river than thunder. "You pack up and get back on whatever trail you came from." The traveler raised his eyebrows, offended that someone with his charm would be denied. "Mind your business, Barrett," he sneered. Jonah's jaw tightened. "When someone's got a hand on another's life, that's my business," he said. The traveler, male volition clouded by too much coin, made a move. It was the kind of move that flips a room into a sharpened space. Folks in the saloon began to stand. Elsie's hands were white on the counter. She felt the old fear again, that particular sickness that had lived inside her since the night her father died and the bank's letters came like knives. But instead of receding, she felt Jonah take a step forward, and with it she felt a reclamation of air. The traveler tried to shove Jonah back, but Jonah did not erupt. He simply held himself steady. It was the steadiness that unseated the traveler's bravado. The man left the saloon not with the dignity he expected but with a bruise from Jonah's steady hand. The saloon murmured. Miss Lazenby's face was a mask of indignation. She thought words would right the world, but words had been answered with action. Afterwards, while the kettle huffed in the corner and the smell of fresh coffee filled the room, Jonah sat across from Elsie with a silence that was a soft hand. Elsa did not ask for rescue. She had not expected it. Women like her were taught to keep their wants small and their faith in luck smaller. She felt a warmth in her chest that was not gratitude alone. It was recognition. Someone had seen her for more than the role handed out. "You didn't have to," she said, voice small. "I reckon I did," Jonah answered, and there was a tired pride in his voice. He looked at her hands and then at her face. "You keep doing right by folks who don't deserve it." She understood that more than he might think. The world sometimes taught you to give to people who didn't appreciate it. It taught you to stitch wounds closed and make them pretty. But that day someone helped her stitch the hole that had been made by ridicule. There was a moment that stretched between them, long enough to hear the tin cups clink. Jonah had a past he kept folded under his coat. A past with names and misdeeds and a reckoning that would not die easily. He had been in a war once, they said, or on the wrong side of the law. Stories changed with retellings. He did not volunteer his history like flour at a mill. He kept to the present because the past had cost him. He was a man with a buried past, guilt that had turned to observation and then to a slow intervention for people he thought had less. Elsie found there was practical comfort in that. A man who had seen his own failings could see the failings of others and know how to stand against them. Days became measures of small kindnesses. Jonah would leave a loaf of bread on the porch before dawn. It was the kind of bread with a crust like life lessons and a soft middle. He would split his last bit of coffee and hand it over with an apologetic smile. He didn't ask for intimacy, and that was part of what made his approach safe. Elsie felt a hunger, not for romance at once but for companionship, the kind that allows a person to breathe without hiding. Then one afternoon, a man from the county seat arrived with official papers. The bank had filed a notice. They were going to auction the farm if the mortgage wasn't settled within 30 days. It was the sort of practical cruelty these towns had as a law. Elsie had parsimonious hope tucked inside her. She had been wearing faith like a thin coat and watched it tear. The county man, a dry fellow, read the notice with the kind of voice that makes a person feel like sand slipping. There was a commotion. People stood in a circle like birds waiting for a storm. Miss Lazenby was pitty for a minute and then sharp as ever. She gave advice that felt like a whip. Sell, get married, do whatever it takes to survive. Elsie took the paper with hands that trembled. The same hands that had once held a child's crooked toy and a husband's wrench before he died. She had paid what she could with the saves of jam jars and pennies hidden away, but it was not enough. She felt the ground under herself open like a mouth. Jonah came by after the town had dispersed. He sat on the porch step and watched the barn and the edges of a place that held 1,000 memories. He spoke little, as if speaking would be a theft. "They can sell what's on paper," he said, "but they can't sell what you keep inside. That's not something any bank owns." Elsie looked at him, lips pressed. "I can't hold it all," she said. "I don't have a way." Jonah traced the grain of the wood with a finger. He had thought about the farm and about how a barn size made the emptiness louder. He had been raised to think in practical measures, boards and nails and banknotes. But there were things that weren't fixable with that alone. He had watched her work and had been moved in ways he didn't expect. "What you got is worth more than the papers say," he finally said. "But I don't have coin enough to pay off that kind of debt. I got a notion, though." He didn't give her the notion in words then. Instead, he began to show up in ways that made people remark. He organized a fall roundup, rallied neighbors to mend the fence lines, and put together a barn fund in a glove box of sorts. People contributed, some out of guilt, some out of respect. Miss Lazenby put in a small coin, which she later called charity. The town put forth small offerings. A calf, a load of corn, spare nails. Jonah refused to be thanked. He said only that it was right. But it was not enough. The bank man's clock was a knife. The days counted down like a metronome. It was a slow and necessary panic. Elsie worked double hours, selling preserves at the general store and stitching extra linens. She took in a boarder, a teacher passing through, who left with kindness and a poem tucked under his pillow. Every cent she could scrape together she did. but the bank's number was higher than the horizon. Jonah watched her from a distance and felt a pressure in his chest as if something inside him was being ground out. He had debts of his own that were not only in coin. He had avoided attachment because attachments cost, and the cost had been lessons learned the hard way. But he had also learned the peculiar mathematics of a small town. A person's dignity could be ransomed if someone stood up to pay it. On the morning of the auction, the sun was a hard coin in the sky. People came with quilts to sell and cattle to be traded. The barn stood like a heavy thing in the middle of the square, the empty rooms echoing. Elsie sat on the porch, hands folded, as if the stillness could somehow pay the debt. Jonah came and stood beside her, not too close but close enough that the space between them felt like a shared thing. "You don't have to sit through this," he said. "I do," she answered. "It's my life." The auction commenced. The bank man read the list with his voice like a ruler. People came, looked at the bids, winked at one another as if this were all entertainment. Miss Lazenby watched like a hawk. Her eyes were a net for judgment. The bidding began low and rose like water finding the highest point. The community folk bid and countered. The price-making was an exhibition of values. Jonah stood in the back, his hat pulled low like a shade. Underneath was a plan that had teeth. When the hammer fell, the highest bid was not the bank's but Jonah's. He had tossed in his own money, of course, but he had also partnered with a few local men who had been moved, and with a land-rich rancher from down the road who had been convinced by Jonah's steady argument. The farm was staying. The hammer crashed down like the sound of someone refusing to be corralled. For a breath, silence sat like an animal that needed tending. Elsie's mouth opened and closed. She moved as if unmoored. Jonah walked to the porch and set a bundle on the step. The papers signed, the proof that the farm would not be taken that day. He did not make a speech. There was no great flourish. He simply handed the thing over like a man giving a tool. "You didn't have to," Elsie said, voice small like a thread. "I did," Jonah said. "Some things aren't for sale." He meant more than the land. He meant the dignity of a woman who had never asked the world to spare her but had held herself upright through ridicule and toil. The auction had turned into a public reckoning, and the town had to look at what it had been willing to take. There were murmurs, some of shame, some of admiration. Miss Lazenby's face was a book of hard chapters. She looked like a person who had been bested by quiet things. Days later, folks said the barn felt different. It was still large, still echoing in the empty corners, but where there had been the cold aloofness of neglect, a warmth had begun to percolate. Neighbors dropped by with offerings and jokes, with tar to mend roofs and stories to fix the boards. The barn filled slowly with not only hay but with the sound of people who had reason now to be part of something. Elsie had a new light in her step, not because she had been rescued from everything, but because someone had chosen to stand with her. She found herself looking out at the fields with a kind of hopeful hunger she had kept secret. The emptiness was being filled not by coin but by care. As the months slipped, so did the distance between her and Jonah. They were not lovers at once. There was a slow kind of folding, a gentle mutual revelation. The barn's long spaces had room enough for whispered conversations and quiet glances. There were evenings where they would sit on the porch with coffee, watching the sky settle into lamplight. In those moments they shared small things. Where each one had been born, the way the weather broke in the hills, the sound that made each of them feel like a child again. They talked of simple truths and things that had been taught by hardship, the recipes for resilience. Jonah would sometimes play the old guitar he recovered from ruins and sing a low tune that made the boards remember their youth. Elsie would hum along, a sound that never made it past her lips before but now settled like a warm hand. They came to each other like two people who had both been carved by storm and who now found a way to patch the cracks with laughter and shared work. They would mend the fence together in late light, Jonah's strong hands teaching her a technique for knotting that made the fence last longer. She showed him how to cook a pie the way her mother had, the smell of apples and cinnamon filling the house. The relationship moved in the slow and honest cadence of people who had learned to keep secrets and now found a space to lay them down. There was no rush to passion. They built a companionship like a strong roof, with beams and tar and patience. But as much as their friendship was a balm, the town did not forget its own ways. Miss Lazenby continued to stir and sting. She liked being a center of opinion and could not abide that Elsie had married the gaze and respect of the community. She found small, petty ways to annoy, throwing offhand remarks at gatherings, making pointed observations that left little cuts. It annoyed Jonah because he liked to fix things. He tried to avoid fighting, but Miss Lazenby had a bitter satisfaction in making people flinch. The town had its slow cruelty that required a constant tending, like weeds. One winter morning, the barn door was found kicked in, tools scattered like the last leaves of autumn. Someone had left a mocking note pinned to the wall, a thing that smelled of cheap whiskey and cowardice. The town's shamer had crossed a line. This was vandalism and meant to be humiliation. Elsie felt the echo of the violation like a hand that had moved across her life and left grease. She went to the place where the note had been, hands shaking. Her silence this time was not a shield but a seam opening. She sat on the porch and felt small. Jonah came like a steady tide, boots kicking up dust. He did not ask a lot. He just began to clean, gather, fix, his movements a kind of prayer. People came forward, their faces quieter than usual. The vandalism had been a line drawn in the town's conscience, and it had pushed some to sympathy. They came to help with hammer and nail. Miss Lazenby watched from her porch, a figure of intransigence, and some of the town muttered things about her, about the way she liked to puncture people to remind them of their place. Jonah did not shout. He told people to set a new plank in there and to lock the door with a new iron hasp. There was a kind of dignity in that busyness. People sat to stew their own admissions as they worked. That night, a storm rolled in, the sky full of a low thunder that felt like a drum. The rain began, and with it the old barn shivered. Jonah and Elsie sat close by the stove, the cold pressing at the windows like a heavy hand. The kettle was a slow voice in the kitchen, steam tracing the air. There were moments when the past refused to be buried and came to knock. In the quiet, Elsie spoke of her father for the first time properly. She told Jonah the day he had died, not with a cheap bitterness but with a roundness that made the story feel complete. Her voice was steady as she worked it from inside like one would pull a thing from a soup. She told him she had been left with the mortgage and the work and the letters from the bank, the many small indignities that accompany loss. She told him about the way the town had reacted, some with kindness and others with sharpness. She did not ask for his pity. She simply laid it like a map for him to see. Jonah listened as if it were scripture. He did not interrupt except to offer small, necessary things. A touch to the hand, a word to anchor a thought. He had his own scars he had not told. He had been an outlaw, men said, or perhaps a man who had been in a war and come home with the edges of it still on him. He told her, little by little, about the men he'd known and the roads that had taken him. He told her it took a long time to be able to stand in the open and not fear being judged for the person you had been and not for the person you might become. He was honest in the way that builds trust, not by grand statements but by small, careful truths. She listened, and when he was done, he did not ask for forgiveness as much as accept a kind of understanding. Their confessions were not meant to be confessionals but acknowledgments that two people with buried pasts could find a way to press soil over old wounds and plant anew. They did not kiss that night. They sat by the dying fire and felt the silence between them change. It was warm now, the kind of cool that feels like a hand laid down on the shoulder. The town began to change in small, audible ways. People who had previously laughed at Elsie began to call her by her proper name. Not in flattery but because they had been led into respect by Jonah's example and their own conscience. Some of the men who had once been quick to mock found themselves humbled by the man who had stood up for dignity. The community's rhythms shifted slowly, a soft tidal movement that made the farm feel safer. Because of the auction, neighbors had come forward with kindness, and because of a man who had learned to bear his own guilt, Elsie was allowed to stand upright. There were more than a few nights when while mending the fence they would talk about what the future might hold. Jonah had plans for repairing the bottom pasture, and for bringing in a couple of cows to steady the farm's income. Elsie listened and felt a cautious hope. They measured their talk not with vows but with practicality, the kind of talk that makes plans because life is a set of necessary chores. She wanted a future that was not built of grandeur but steadiness, like a stitched seam that holds. Their intimacy grew like a slow bloom. They shared meals, and sometimes they would hold hands when they walked to town. Sometimes they would sit in the barn and fix tools under the dim lamplight, the air smelling of oil and straw. They never rushed. They let the pace be set by the weather and the state of the barns. People who watched them said it was the kind of love that meant to stay. Miss Lazenby watched with a small resentment she hid poorly. Her savoring of disapproval had been her pastime, and now it was becoming a thing of the past. Then the crisis came, not with a bang but with a whisper. A rumor that the bank might change its terms and ask for a further settlement. Money is a thing that can reappear like a ghost in a place where debts never cease. The town felt the tremor when the letters arrived. It came the same way a letter always arrives, with a thick, official voice. The new demand was small compared to the farm's value, but it was enough to unsettle. Elsie felt the world tilt, familiar as a raindrop. Jonah listened to the news with a face that said he had measured the economy of hope before and did not like the arithmetic. He sat back as if weighing options. He could have, he thought, left. A man with a past has often the chance to start over alone. But he had learned that the measure of a man is not the sum of his comings. He had come to care in a way that was not simple. He had a life of his own that might have been rudely interrupted, but the past had taught him to stand. He rallied friends again, and for a day the town's heart bit down on what it owed. Men whose lives were not interwoven like ropes came together, some with coin, some with labor. The bank eventually relented, perhaps because the town had turned its gaze into a weight. It was also because Jonah kept a steady pressure on the man in the bank, not with threats but with the kind of quiet that hints at consequences. His past helped with that because he knew men who moved with their fists and their words. When the bank backed down, some of the town breathed out like a collective thing that had been holding a secret, terrifying breath. There was a small celebration that felt more inward than an outward parade, as if the community had learned something about itself. Elsie and Jonah stood close while the barn filled with laughter and clatter. They watched the young ones run and felt a satisfaction that was not sung but savored like a shared meal. Time, that tireless meter, kept moving. Months ran their course, and with them a small family life took root. There were winters with harsh winds and summers where the fields bore stubborn fruit. The barn was no longer a place that whispered emptiness. It breathed with the life of tools, laughter, and a stable heap of hay. Jonah's humility folded into a confidence that was not boastful but secure. Elsie's stoicism softened but did not melt. She remained the moral center of the farm, a woman who had learned to be both kind and unyielding when necessary. Together, they ran the farm, kept the stove warm, and opened the porch to neighbors who needed help. People who had once mocked now had cause to respect. The town itself was a slow work in progress. Miss Lazenby reduced her biting remarks, not by changing heart but by seeing that some of her audience had thinned. She became quieter when she noticed the way people no longer followed her every shuttle of cruelty. The shamer always needs an audience, and audiences have a way of dwindling in the face of steady decency. There were nights when she sat on her porch, knitting in a way that made people think she was mellowing. But the truth of their lives remained. Sometimes people change out of hunger, sometimes out of reflection. The town became kinder not by decree but through 1,000 small shifts, each one a small act. The deeper cost in their story came near 9 years in, when Jonah's past rose like the tide of a cold ocean. A man Jonah had wronged in the past, a gambler who had tasted the bitterness of lost fortunes, came riding into town with a vindictive ambition. He had gathered a grudge like a map and thought the time had come to cash it in. He had a knack for making trouble the way some men had a knack for making fire. His arrival was like a crack in a jar. He set about testing Jonah, prodding with small insults and threats meant to draw Jonah out into a field where reputations are settled with a fist. Jonah had kept to himself these years and had a life carefully built. The gambler wanted to take it down. He went to the saloon and began to speak of Jonah with a venom that made people uncomfortable. He called him names that belonged to the past and tried to set a mood of suspicion. The town watched, and Jonah felt the pressure but kept himself measured. Miss Lazenby watched with a strange satisfaction. Old habits are hard to rid oneself of. She thought the drama made her important again. But culture had shifted sufficiently that some folks were tired of settling disputes with fists. Jonah had a reputation as a man who had learned not to strike without cause. He was measured but not a coward. He had had enough of the gambler's games when the gambler pushed his hand too far. The gambler, in a fit of cruelty and wanting to make the heart of the man he hated break, chose to make a public attack not on Jonah but on Elsie. He sought an audience at the fair that year and tried to humiliate Elsie in front of the community that had finally come to accept her. He accused her of theft in a voice that was meant to break a person. He pointed fingers and made the circle of onlookers close like wolves. People took breath. Fear of violence is as common as the scent of smoke. Elsie stood straight, her chin a little higher than before. She felt the old shame try to curl into her like a familiar blanket. But something inside of her had been changed by the time Jonah came forward. He went to the center, and when he spoke his voice had an edge that made the night listen. "Enough," Jonah said. "Ain't no man's right to stand and make a spectacle of another. You accuse her. You better have the proof." The gambler raged and made a charge. He pushed Jonah, and the room dissolved into a roar. People scattered, some hoping for entertainment, some fearful of the trouble. Jonah, slow as winter, caught the man's arm and with one motion sent him stumbling to the ground. It was not a blow but a quick calculation. A man who knew how to stop a fight without killing a soul. The gambler went away with the town shunning him and with his reputation for tyranny diminished. The shame that had been aimed at Elsie had no hook. For Elsie, the scene was not the triumphant thing a novel might script. She had not been saved with trumpets. But she was defended, and that defense changed the tenor of what people believed were acceptable behaviors. It stripped the thin varnish off the idea that one could humiliate someone and be applauded. The town had been forced to reckon. Jonah's quiet intervention, this time in a more direct way, made the room change its ways. The resolution that followed was not easy, but it was real. The gambler left town with a diminished step, trading his swagger for the knowledge that his cheap cruelties were not welcomed here. Miss Lazenby had to swallow a measure of shame, and while she would never be easy, she left some of her most venomous habits behind as if pruning a bush. The town had been taught that the kind of cruelty practiced in whispers in corners would be answered. People began to keep their tongues in their teeth. On a late summer night, when the crickets sang and the barn's rafters kept the long-ago scent of hay, Elsie and Jonah sat by the stove. They had been through indignities and salvations both, and the world had tightened around them like a good coat. She had been the moral center for so long. Jonah had been the man with a buried past who stepped into the light. They looked at one another across the small, cluttered table like people who had kept their hands clean. "Do you ever think," she said softly, "that if things had been different you might have left?" He shook his head. "No," he said. "I been a fool and a wrongdoer and I been right. But I ain't a man to leave when folks need something. Least of all you." She laughed, a small sound that matched the sunbeam through the kitchen window. "You picked me the way someone picking a flower, Jonah. You made sure I was safe. You made sure I had a home. I picked you because you were standing when the world told you not to," he said. "That's something worth a lot more than all the estate papers in the county." There were quiet months after that when their companionship deepened into the sort that does not need announcements. They planted a garden near the house with a scarlet row of tomatoes and turnips. They had a child after a season, a small thing with Jonah's square jaw and Elsie's kind eyes, and the barn grew more alive than ever. The child's laughter rattled the rafters and made the large space feel like a chest that had been filled with something real. The farm prospered gently, not because of schemes but because of steady work and a town that had learned to be less cruel. People often ask what makes a town change. It is not bullhorns or decrees but the cumulative effect of small acts. Jonah's interventions had a way of spreading like the root of a tree into the community's soil. He had stood up in small and then larger ways. The town's shamer had been shown up, not with fury but with steady truth. Elsie had practiced her stoicism and learned that being quiet wasn't surrender when someone else's voice had your back. Their story was, for many, a model of how the smallest mercy can change a landscape. Years bled into a life that was steadier and kinder. The barn, once a hollow echo, now swallowed the sound of work and songs, of children's laughter, and the slow rhythm of a town at peace with itself. Jonah aged a little, his hair going silver at the temples. Elsie's face showed lines that were not all sorrow but the marks of laughter as well. They grew into a kind of oldness together that made people think of them as fixtures like the barn itself. Reliable, restful, a part of the town's map. On an evening when the light was the gold of a memory, the two of them stood at the barn door. The sun made the dust hang like a curtain, catching in the air. The children were chasing one another, their voices a full-bodied music. Jonah turned his hat in his hands like a man who was keeping time. Elsie stood with a quiet that had once been brittle and now had melted into a comfortable peace. "You ever think of leaving now?" she asked, a small tease on her lips. He laughed and rested his hand on hers, the calluses from his hands a steady proof of a life worked. "Not now," he said. "This barn is ours too." She watched him, the man who had saved her from more than just a bank, who had saved her from the town's nastiness and from her own tendency to vanish. He had stood up, not with pronouncements but with a steadiness that required less drama and more heart. The town had learned to change because someone refused to let cruelty be a pastime. Their love did not end with fireworks. It matured like good wood that holds fire a long time. In the garden they grew. There were rows of herbs and flowers that nodded like memories. The barn hummed with a harmonious measure, the floors marking the imprint of lives lived with care. The farmer's daughter had become more than a title. She was the woman who had kept the faith and then been rewarded by a man who did not flinch when duty called. Years later, when Jonah died with a quiet dignity that matched the way he had lived, in the night, his hand in Elsie's, the town came. People wept and told the tall stories that grow around a well-loved man. Miss Lazenby came to the funeral with a stiff hand, and there were no words extra needed to make her sympathy seem real. The community had been changed enough that even the town's harsh edges were softened. Elsie carried on, the way people do who have been loved and must now continue. She ran the farm, watched her children grow, and taught them to be kind in the ways Jonah had taught her. She kept the barn, kept it clean, and opened it for neighbors when storms came. She never let the emptiness return. Where emptiness once had pressed on her, she filled the space with work and laughter and a memory that tasted like bread and coffee and the slow assertion of dignity. In the end, when she sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the sunset lay the fields down like a sleeping thing, she thought about the odd and tender arithmetic of the world. How one person's small kindness can ripple out. She thought about the times Jonah had simply been another body in a room and the time he had chosen to speak and the time he had chosen to stand. If you saw yourself in her, stoic, dismissed, hiding your softness beneath silence, she had a thing to tell you. Be brave enough to hold on to the quiet goodness you have. If you saw yourself in him, bulky with a buried past, guilt heavy, careful with your hands, she had another thing to tell you. It's never too late to stand up for someone. You don't have to be a hero. You only have to be